Welcome to Inside 340B Report, an insightful conversation between 340B Report's editorial team on the key issues affecting the 340B drug discount program, the nation's second largest government drug program. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Ted Slafsky, 340B Report's publisher and CEO, and I'm joined today by 340B Report associate editors and senior writers, Shannon Young and Will Newton, as well as our national correspondent, Luke Zarzecki. Before we dive into the latest 340B developments, I wanted to let our listeners know that we're pleased to offer a special 25% discount to 340B Report first-time subscribers. You can go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use the coupon code podcast25 to take advantage of the discount. I know you will find the news service to be a valuable investment. Also, I want to encourage you to check out 340B Report's business-focused podcast, 340B Leaders Up Front, hosted by Anna Mangum. The podcast showcases conversations with industry executives who are at the cutting edge of innovation and leadership in the 340B space. Quite a bit has happened in the 340B world since our latest episode. Today, we'll discuss Eli Lilly's move to begin to cut off 340B pricing for certain hospitals, the latest in HRSA's efforts to implement another rebate pilot, HRSA's decision not to appeal a key hospital purchasing policy ruling, and the latest 340B activity in the States. Shannon, can you tell me more about what happened with Lilly as our recording today, June 18th?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by, as Ted mentioned, noting this is a developing story, and this is all of the information that we have as of Thursday, June 18th. So as you may recall from our previous episode, Eli Lilly is one of 11 drug makers that's announced an in-house pharmacy claims data requirement for 340B providers, and that's for them to be able to access 340B pricing. So as of Thursday morning, we started to hear reports from hospitals, notably 340B Health, which is a trade group that represents 340B hospitals, reached out with a statement noting that some of their members, more than a dozen, were unable to access 340B pricing. These were hospitals that didn't comply with Eli Lilly's policy. And as you may remember, earlier in the month, Eli Lilly had been threatening to cut off this pricing if hospitals didn't comply within a few days. We hadn't really heard anything until today when these hospitals were unable to access the pricing. First, we heard from 340B Health. Then we reached out to HRSA. We reached out to Lilly. And Lilly got back to us. A spokesman said, quote, "As explained in our June 1st letter, Lilly is collecting claims data to stop the rampant fraud, waste, and abuse in the 340B program that is harming employers, state and federal governments, and patients. We announced this requirement in January, sent multiple reminders, and we've reached out individually to these entities to discuss, all without success. We hope these hospitals reconsider their decision and submit claims data to accept Lilly's offer of 340B pricing." So hospitals, after not being able to access this pricing through the trade groups, called on the federal government to step in. They've been doing this all along. 340B Health sent a letter to HRSA asking for them to intervene. Hospital groups are arguing that these claims data requirements are illegal and violate the 340B statute. And HRSA has pretty much stayed out of it until this point. A spokesperson reached out to us after we asked them for comment. They said that the agency, quote, continues to review these policies to determine next steps, and that the agency remains committed to ensuring compliance with statutory eligibility requirements, strengthening program oversight, and enhancing enforcement to protect the integrity of the 340B program. So HRSA really hasn't signaled what they're going to do on it. The American Hospital Association also confirmed that this was happening and called on HRSA to take action. And so it's kind of a wait and see at this point. Notably, Lilly is the first drug maker to follow through on enforcing its policy. And it's going to be a wait and see as to whether other drug makers follow suit. Ted, do you want to just give us a little bit of perspective or insight on what you think the next steps we'll see on this are?
Yeah, well, I know that the covered entity community has been frustrated by a lack of response from HRSA I believe that if HRSA doesn't go ahead and try to stop these actions by the manufacturers, that there will now be an effort by the hospitals and potentially other providers impacted by this to sue the agency for not following the statute and not protecting the program. As many of you may recall, who listened to our podcast and read our publication, there was an important 2011 Supreme Court decision that basically said that the covered entities don't have a private right of action where they could just sue the manufacturers themselves. They actually have to use the government to be the police person for this program. And as of now, I don't know what HRSA is going to do. I'm sure they're getting various input from both the industry side and the provider side. And I know that the administration is trying to remain friendly with the drug industry when it comes to the negotiations for their Medicare discounts. So we shall see what happens. But I definitely feel like there will be legal action soon if the government doesn't begin to try to stop the manufacturers from these requirements.
Thanks for that, Ted. And Luke, I know you've been covering this issue. You've been in contact with different attorneys and providers over the last couple of weeks as we've been waiting to see what Lilly's action was going to be. So what have you found in your reporting?
Going off of what Ted was talking about with some of the possible legal actions that could take place in the future, well, we could also see what I gathered from my conversations with some attorneys who represent providers is that Lilly's new policy could trigger a lobbying blitz in states to shield more covered entities from similar claims data policies. And as Shannon mentioned, 11 drug makers have announced in-house claims data collection policies, with Lilly being the first to announce enforcement efforts. And many states actually have laws that ban drug makers from conditioning 340B pricing on claims data submissions now required under federal law. And so my sources told me that more states could move to pass similar laws since Lilly has respected those laws and exempted covered entities in those states from needing to comply with its policy.
It sounds a little bit like a cat and mouse game. It's interesting, Luke. We've got these new policies, then we see new actions in the states to try to protect the providers. And then there's a new restriction, and now they have to go back to the states and try to get relief again. And it seems like the federal government is basically paralyzed when it comes to enforcing the rules of this program or making movement on Capitol Hill. So I definitely agree with you there, Luke. I think that we're going to see a lot of action in the states. And I know you had mentioned in your excellent story today that a lot of the state legislatures are adjourned for the year. I wouldn't be surprised that some of them will go into session for various reasons, and maybe we'll get a few of these bills perhaps enacted. In fact, I think, and I don't know, was it you, Will, that wrote a story about Vermont? And they may have actually tried to address this just this week. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, Will?
Yeah, definitely. So Vermont last year was one of the many states that enacted a contract pharmacy access law. And part of that law was that it prohibited manufacturers from requiring claims data at the contract pharmacy setting in order to access 340B pricing. And so just very recently, about a week or so ago, the Vermont governor signed a update to the law, and that extended that requirement. So now manufacturers aren't just prohibited from requiring claims data at the contract pharmacy setting, but they're also prohibited from requiring claims data at the in-house pharmacy setting as well. So as Luke kind of mentioned there, that's sort of an early indication of potential actions that possibly more states will take as they kind of evolve their 340B laws in order to match what's happening in the particular national landscape.
Yeah, well, we'll be keeping an eye out. And it's actually, in some ways, that's exciting news for us. Will, just when you thought you were going to get a break from the state action, you may actually have to keep a close eye on that in the next few months, even though most of the legislatures will be taking some time off. some of them not going back until next year. So we'll keep a close eye on that. And Luke, good reporting on an issue that will be one of major focus for the stakeholders in the 340B program. Let's pivot now to a story that you worked on just today, Will. You wrote a great piece about some new information that was published by HRSA related to the rebate program. Could you tell us more about that?
So, as all of this has been happening with Lilly kind of very much in the headlines behind the scene, HRSA has really continued to chug away and put in a lot of effort towards implementing another 340B rebate pilot. And HRSA, as you mentioned, Ted, they released and published some new regulatory documents this week that they submitted to the White House's Office of Management and Budget related to their plans for a 340B rebate pilot. And we have a lot of information about the documents themselves, links to them as well in our reporting. But sort of the most important thing is what these documents signal about how HRSA is approaching a rebate pilot. And from following this ourselves and from speaking to attorneys, including a former HRSA official, it's pretty clear that HRSA is very laser focused on trying to make a rebate pilot happening. It's one of its top priorities. And it's also pretty clear that HRSA is going through great lengths to try and avoid some of the missteps that led federal courts to strike down its original rebate pilot. So that lawsuit, it was brought by hospitals, and federal courts ultimately blocked the rebate pilot on procedural grounds, said that HRSA had not followed the right procedures when it went about trying to implement a rebate pilot for this year. And we've seen HRSA respond. So last year, they tried to advance some regulatory documents through an emergency clearance. This year, HRSA is going through the more traditional process. Last year, we saw HRSA not really respond to any comments. This year, what we're seeing is that HRSA is going through lengths to at least acknowledge the fact that it has received comments and allow more comment periods. But kind of the big question and most interesting part, though, is the question of administrative burden. And one of the key things that the judges really honed in on when they struck down the original rebate pilot was this idea that HRSA had not really adequately taken into account the potential administrative burden for covered entities. And so HRSA came out this year in late February with an estimate that complying with the rebate pilot would take covered entities an average of 5 hours a week. It received 180 something comments on this, many of which came from providers who argued that this was a pretty big underestimate of the burden, but some that also came from manufacturers who argued that there was not much of a burden. And sort of after receiving all of those comments, what we learned this week is that HRSA has doubled down on that assessment. It's saying that it still believes that a rebate pilot would take covered entities an average of 5 hours a week. I spoke to a former HRSA official who used to be involved in a lot of these regulatory processes. And she said that this was an unprecedented number of comments that HRSA had received on this relatively mundane Paperwork Reduction Act filing. And she also argued that it was, quote, mind-boggling that HRSA had not updated its assessment of the administrative burden on covered entities based on this. So all of this is to say that HRSA really wants this to happen. It's trying to leave a paper trail showing that this time around it actually did take into account the administrative burden for covered entities. But whether or not HRSA adequately did this in the court's eyes remains to be seen, because we do expect there will be a legal challenge to any potential rebate pilot. And so we're sort of now at this point waiting to see what's going to happen. We know HRSA is almost certainly going to release a rebate pilot plan for drugs subject to Medicare drug price negotiation in 2026 and 2027. What we don't really know is how the legal challenges will play out this time around. So we're going to continue to follow this very closely.
Well, that was very good reporting, Will, and glad you were able to get that information in today's issue. Before we continue, let's take a moment to hear from one of our great sponsors.
Vital One, formerly Maxer, is the nation's only independent, fully integrated total pharmacy solutions partner. By combining pharmacy operations, 340B management, specialty pharmacy, pharmacy benefit management, and patient affordability solutions, Vital One is dedicated to helping mission-driven hospitals and healthcare providers improve outcomes, unlock revenue, and reinvest in healthier healthcare communities. Learn more at www.vitalone.com. That's www.vitalone.com.
Shannon, there was a legal development in that suit related to hospital purchasing practices. Can you tell us more about what that matter is and what happened there?
Yeah, definitely. So the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, decided not to appeal a March 31st DC District Court ruling that struck down a 13-year-old HRSA policy that restricted how certain 340B hospitals can purchase their initial drug inventory. So by not appealing this, it's unclear exactly what's going to happen next, but it is seen as a good move for hospitals who had sued the administration over this policy. And this is all revolving around the policy known as the GPO prohibition. And that remains in place right now, but hospitals can consider implementing interpretations of the statute that aren't constrained by it. So again, this is seen as a key victory for group purchasing organizations, specifically Premier, which is a major GPO that had sued HRSA over this policy. It's also a major win for hospitals. 340B hospitals have long argued that this is burdensome and significantly increased costs for cash-strapped safety net health systems. And so provider advocates celebrated this decision to not appeal. HRSA had 60 days to appeal it, so that was about June 1st. They didn't do it by that deadline. Provider advocates have noted that the 2013 guidance is now permanently vacated. And so the GPO prohibition bars certain hospitals from purchasing outpatient drugs through both the 340B program and the GPO simultaneously. Hospitals can now have more flexibility to first purchase new drugs through GPO accounts rather than high-price wholesale acquisition or WAC accounts. Of note, a few attorneys said that HRSA could still issue a proposed rule to reestablish the 2013 policy, but in a way that complies with the Administrative Procedures Act and provides, quote, a reasoned explanation for its WAC first purchasing policy. The agency could also conclude that the policy lacks statutory support and replace the 2013 notice with a different policy or not issue a replacement policy. Courts have previously found that HRSA has limited 340B rulemaking authority outside of ceiling price calculations, manufacturer civil monetary penalties, and the administrative dispute resolution process. So that means that the agency would likely only be able to issue guidance rather than publish a regulation. We asked HRSA about this, and a spokesperson said, quote, HRSA will continue to administer the program consistent with its statutory authorities and responsibilities. So again, unclear exactly what their plans are there. Premier, the GPO that had sued HRSA over this, said the decision provides, quote, important clarity and removes a policy that created unnecessary complexity and cost for hospitals. And it will, quote, continue to monitor developments closely and advocate for policies that support provider efficiency, compliance, and patient access to care. So Ted, want to give us a little bit of background on this issue and why hospitals were so opposed to this policy?
Yeah, it sort of came out of the blue in 2013. For years, hospitals were able to purchase their initial purchase of a drug product through the GPO, and then when they were able to identify if it was a 340B drug, they would then change it down the road. But then HRSA said, no, you can only buy it through your wholesale acquisition cost account, which is basically the highest price you can pay for a drug. And this was quite frustrating and quite costly for the hospitals in the program. And they never felt like, first of all, that there was any legal basis for it. And also believe that they certainly did not go through the right legal steps. HRSA did in order to try to implement this policy. But there was no suit against the government until fairly recently. And Premier, which has thousands of hospitals that utilized their services were successful in this suit. So it's going to be an interesting case. It'll be interesting to see what happens next and whether hospitals begin to try to change some of their purchasing patterns. Of course, they are still limited. Overall, they can't be using their GPO for all of their drug purchases. I think it is an important decision, but one that is not going to be a massive change in how the 340B program works. Interestingly, one of the attorneys who represented Premier in the case, Emily Cook, is going to be on a panel with me and a few other great speakers at the National Harbor here just outside of Washington, D.C. on July 13th. This is going to occur right before the start of the 340B Coalition Conference. And this Monday morning event, which is open to all, requires separate registration from the conference. And it's going to be hosted by Verity Solutions, which is one of our sponsors. So I would encourage you to go to the show notes and register. As I mentioned, it's a separate event than the coalition meeting, but it's at the same venue. And I hope to see as many of our listeners and subscribers there as possible. So we'll keep an eye on that, Shannon, and see whether HRSA decides to do anything about it or whether they just are going to just let that new policy be. Switching topics again, Will, I know that you talked a little bit already about Vermont and what happened just recently there. I understand there's some developments in Washington State. And also, if you could just give our listeners just a quick reminder about what happened in Illinois and what we're waiting for there.
Yeah, definitely. And so we talked a little bit about Vermont. Luke talked a little bit about the potential for more state activity to come. But what we've seen by and large in 2026 is that the battleground over these state laws has been playing out in the courts. And so the biggest recent ruling that we saw was over Washington state's law. Washington was the only state this year so far to have enacted a 340B contract pharmacy law. It took effect earlier this month, and a federal judge denied several drug makers' motions to temporarily block enforcement of the law. So that means that Washington's law is in effect right now. And this law has a number of important 340B provisions. So the first one is kind of the standard one. It prohibits drug makers from restricting the delivery of 340B drugs to contract pharmacies. Also prohibits manufacturers from conditioning 340B pricing on claims data requirements. Again, as Shannon and Luke have already outlined, this is becoming particularly noteworthy as more manufacturers move to place this type of restriction. It also has some new provider reporting requirements, and it's the first state law that also includes manufacturer-specific 340B reporting requirements. So that'll be very interesting to see the results of those reports and sort of continue to follow. I know Shannon's written several articles about manufacturers that have begun exempting Washington state providers as a result of this. So we'll be continuing to follow that and keep all of our trackers updated. And then, as you mentioned, Ted, Washington State's the only one so far, but it does look like Illinois could be number 2 in terms of state action in 2026. So there are actually 2 340B bills in Illinois right now that are awaiting action from the governor. One is a contract pharmacy and claims data prohibition bill. The other is a 340B provider reporting bill. Based on sort of the action, it does seem like the legislature, even though these 2 bills were ultimately passed separately, is viewing them as sort of working in tandem. So we're still waiting to see whether or not either or both or neither of these are signed, but it very much is looking like Illinois is going to join the number of states to do sort of a combined 340B contract pharmacy and reporting measure.
Yeah, and I would say, Will, if I'm correct, the margins of support for both of those bills was very, very high. Am I right there, Will?
Yeah, so what's been interesting, and this is especially true in Illinois, is ultimately when these bills were put up for a vote, there was very wide support behind them. Sort of the issue is that there is a very long time where the bill was not put up for a vote. So that sort of indicates that lawmakers very much, when they're forced to vote and kind of go public on this, tend to be, at least in Illinois, tended to be very supportive of this. But I think a lot of the negotiations and lobbying was happening behind the scenes, because there certainly was, dating back all the way to the end of last year, because its session carries over, where this bill was awaiting action in the Illinois House.
Okay, and Governor Pritzker has a little bit more time before making the decision, but one would think he's probably going to sign it, considering the margins.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we don't have any specific indication, and sources in the states haven't said anything definitively. I mean, we don't have any indication that he won't. And generally, as you said, when these bills get a wide margin, they are passed, particularly when, it's a very blue state like Illinois. But yeah, we don't have a definitive indication at this point.
Okay, well, we'll keep a close eye on that. And thank you so much for that good reporting in the states, and good job, everyone, on covering all these important federal developments. And I will be excited to learn more in our next podcast. But for now, I think that brings us to the end of today's episode. We'll continue to keep an eye on all things 340B related, and be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Of course, we will report on anything that happens in the meantime on our website. Please follow along with our twice weekly newsletters. And just a friendly reminder, if you're not a current subscriber, you can take advantage of our 25% discount for first-time subscribers only by going to 340breport.com, clicking the subscribe button, and using the discount code podcast25. Thank you for joining us.